VO2 max is the rate at which your body can consume oxygen during exercise. When designing this VO2 max feature, we brought in over 300 people to do these tests.
Is it fair to say that your VO2 max is a measure of your cardiovascular health?
Absolutely. It does reflect the ability of the cardiorespiratory system to deliver oxygen to the muscle. That's why how much oxygen we can consume matters, because we as human beings, if we're doing work, either sport or just walking to the car, need to produce energy to prevent that onset of fatigue.
For a person who's starting out to improve VO2 max, where should they start? Dr. Grosicki, welcome back.
Dr. Holmes, thrilled to be here again.
So pumped to talk about VO2 Max and to just get into all the nitty-gritty details. We're going to start off by talking about the rigor behind the feature. I think that's really important to set the stage in terms of just the credibility of the data that folks are getting. I think is a really important place to start, and frankly, we're really proud of it. And you had such a huge part in making sure that we had the level of rigor that we needed behind this feature. So huge shout out to your role in that. And then we'll go in just the how, the why, how to think about training, how to back in. I think for folks who are trying to design a training plan, it's thinking about, all right, how much time do I actually have to train over the course of the week? And if I'm thinking about this 80-20 ratio, 80% of the time I'm in zone 2, 20% of the time I'm in zone 5, kind of in that like VO2 max threshold. What does that actually look in terms of how I plan my training? So would love to kind of back into that just to help people think about their week in a more tactical way. And then I think we should probably also talk about we know strength training is a really important component to kind of overall health and longevity. How do we think about strength training? So if I have a total of X amount of hours over the course of the week, what proportion am I doing zone 2? What is the proportion of I'm doing zone 5? And then how do I think about my strength training in that context? I think giving people a framework of how to think about that would be super useful. So does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, no, perfect. My favorite conversation as an exercise physiologist.
So we're a physiological monitoring device at our core. Having an exercise physiologist who is inside our building is obviously really, really important. Talk about just how we created a foundation to be able to train our data in a way that allows us to give you a really good estimate of your VO2 max.
One of the things we see, right, is that wearables and companies have been providing VO2 max estimates now for almost a decade. We are not the first to do it, but there's a reason for that. And that's because when we provide people that estimate, we wanted to make sure we got it absolutely correct. So how did we do that? Right.
So our lateness was just due to rigor.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's absolutely no value providing our members data that's not actionable and actually accurate. We went to the state-of-the-art science to figure out how to do that. There's a paper published by academics all over the world. It's actually a consortium known as the Towards Intelligent Health and Well-Being Network of Physical Activity Assessment Consortium, which somehow they come up with Interlive, which I'm sure they, plucked those letters. It sounds really cool. And these are leading experts in wearable tech and particularly estimating key physiological metrics with wearable tech. So they've provided wearable tech companies with valuable information to, if you're providing people with resting heart rate, this is how it should be done. If you're providing people with steps, this is how it should be done. And in the journal Sports Medicine in 2022, they published this really high impact paper. And if we look at academic journals in the field of sports medicine is as high as it gets. And in this paper, they provided very detailed and specific guidance for how wearable companies should go about this. And when designing this VO2 Max feature, we use these recommendations as our Bible. And they provided very specific and actionable ways that we could do that. To give just some indications of things and key considerations there. First, what is the target population that you are trying to estimate VO2 max in? We know at Whoop that we're not just trying to unlock human performance, but we are actually now trying to unlock healthspan, right? And so that means we're not just providing VO2 max estimates for 30-year-old collegiate athletes or the 40-year-old CrossFit athlete. We're trying to provide accurate VO2 max estimates for people who are 80 and people who are 18. So how do we do that? That means when we're sampling people and bringing members and non-members into the lab for these gold standard tests, we need to bring everyone in or else our algorithms aren't going to accurately predict that.
So diversity is just
an incredibly diverse sample.
I mean, when we talk about recruiting for studies, that's part of the limitation of most studies is that we don't actually have that diversity that we need to train an algorithm to be reflective of this kind of huge span that you're talking about in terms of age and biosex, et cetera.
Yeah, incredibly challenging. And the folks in data science thought this through very strategically. Before they did any of the testing, they set out what are the buckets of people we need? What are the age ranges? What are the fitness levels of the people we want to come in taking these tests? So it was all very thought out beforehand. It wasn't just let's recruit, the first 200 or so or more. We know we have more, right?
Yeah.
People that we could get to do these tests. So that's just one of the components.
So knowing how many folks we actually need in each one of those buckets in order to have enough data to train an algorithm.
Yep. To provide, again, a really accurate measurement for anybody.
So talk a little bit about just the metabolic cart, just so people understand, what does an actual VO2 max test entail?
Yeah.
And what are we trying to derive from it?
Sure. And that's another thing that's very unique about what we did. And they specify this again in that paper by the InterLive Consortium. They say that when you're making these algorithms and designing these algorithms to predict VO2 max, they're very specific about what you need to be training your data against or predicting is a gold standard VO2 max test using indirect calorimetry. What does that mean? It means we are measuring the amount of air someone is breathing out and breathing in, and we're measuring the concentration of gas, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide, in the air they're breathing out and breathing in. Because with VO2 max, we know it's how much oxygen someone is consuming per unit time. And so it's absolutely essential that if we're trying to predict that, we need that to be measured. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. When I was teaching exercise physiology, we would always start out with submaximal tests, and those will look like things like putting someone on a bike at a given workload and looking at what their heart rate response is to that workload. And sure, we can estimate what someone's VO2 max is, but our members could just go do that on any sort of bike and predict or estimate their own VO2 max. And that's not what these members are paying for. And that's not what we gave them. We gave them gold standard training data.
And just tell just the unit of measurement that we use, just because we'll reference that throughout the podcast, just so people can orientate around that unit.
Yeah, no, certainly. So VO2 max is measured in a lab in liters of oxygen per minute. So that's the liters of oxygen that someone's consuming per minute. Now, that's not the measure that we most frequently hear of when we hear about VO2 max. If I'm telling you someone's VO2 max in liters per minute, it's probably going to be anywhere from 2 to 7, perhaps, on the higher end of liters of oxygen per minute. But VO2 max, I like to think of as the size of the engine in a car, or the size of the engine in the person. And while understanding how big that engine is great, what's more informative when we think about performance and also healthspan is understanding how big that engine is for the size of the car, right? If you and I and someone who's 6'6" all have the same size engine, it's not going to move as fast in the person who's 6'6" as it is in you or I who's much smaller, right? We most frequently will normalize that for someone's body weight in kilograms. And so when we hear VO2 max discussed, we hear it referred to as a number that's relative to the size of the individual. And so we hear a number of milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. And those numbers are going to range from maybe down near 10 to 20 and people who are not as healthy, all the way up to very close to 100 in the fittest people on earth.
The endurance athletes.
Yeah, the extreme endurance athletes.
Extreme
yeah.
endurance athletes. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Is there anything else about just kind of the metric itself and the testing that you feel like folks should know?
About our testing, I think for sure. We brought in over 300 people to Whoop Labs to do these tests. There was very strict protocols before they came in as far as refraining from vigorous activity, knowing what they had done in the past, right? Controlling, making sure that they're eating and drinking and taking of anti-inflammatory drugs or other things that might influence these measures. This is all very tightly controlled. Before every test, we calibrated the metabolic cart. We bought the best metabolic cart there is, the Parvomedics metabolic cart. It is the absolute gold standard for doing this. And then after every test, and as specified by the InterLive Consortium, and they looked at, I think it was something like 17 independent external validations of VO2 max, and very few actually verified that the individual doing the test had reached their VO2 max, their true VO2 max. And what's important is that we did that. There's a number of different criteria you can look at, 4 of them that are primarily used. One of them is Did the individual's oxygen uptake plateau during that test? What was their self-perceived exertion at the end of that test? What was their respiratory exchange ratio, which is really a measure of fuel utilization at the end of that test? And then how high did their heart rate get? And we looked at every single one of those metrics to validate that the training data we were using for these tests was absolutely gold standard.
So we took the very strictest protocol and applied that to our testing. I love that. All right, so I think we have a really good definition of VO2 max. Maybe just a definition that's not as technical, but just kind of zoom out for the layperson. What is the definition of VO2 max for the layperson?
Yeah, and everyone gives you the same definition, right? Which is the rate at which your body can consume oxygen during exercise, which is great, right? But why exactly does that matter? That, I think, is often what's missing when people define what VO2 max is, right? You can look in a large language model. You can Google VO2 max is the rate at which oxygen can be consumed during exercise. Okay, great. Why do we as exercise physiologists care so much about VO2 max? Why has it become the most ubiquitous measure in all of exercise physiology? For very good reason. VO2 max is this integrated metric that reflects all of the bodily systems working together during physical activity or during work to produce energy and to prevent fatigue. And that's why how much oxygen we can consume matters, because we as human beings, if we're doing work, either sport or just walking to the car, depending on our level of fitness, need to produce energy to prevent that onset of fatigue, right? We want to be able to sustain a given task. And how much oxygen we can consume is directly related to our ability to produce energy without reaching fatigue.
Now, I think people immediately, and for good reason, just think that this is purely a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness, which it is. Maybe just kind of talk about your musculoskeletal health and how that might influence this measure. And is it fair to say that your VO2 max is just as much a measure of your cardiovascular health, I would say the health of your nervous system? Is it also a metric that can give us some insight of your musculoskeletal health?
One of the beautiful things about it is this holistic physiological measurement that does reflect the performance of all bodily systems, right? And it does reflect the ability of the cardiorespiratory system to deliver oxygen to the muscle, but equally as important, just like you're getting at, is the muscle's ability to take up that oxygen and use it to produce energy. And so if you're okay with it, I think a really logical next step and a cool way for our listeners to understand this would be to just kind of provide high-level overview. What is the equation that we use to determine VO2 max? And then I think from there we can use that as a way to kind of get down into the more nitty-gritty of like, how do you improve it?
Love it.
Because I think to understand how to improve VO2 max, understanding the physiology behind it is essential. And it's not nearly as complex as we would think. When I'm teaching this to undergraduates in exercise physiology or graduates in exercise physiology, I write on the board, like first day of class, I'm like, you absolutely need to know this equation. It's beautiful, it's simple, and it really defines our existence in human beings. And it's known as the Fick equation. The Fick equation, I'm going to start with kind of the complex version and then distill it down.
It's so funny because anyone who's like inside physiology is like, the Fick equation. Like it's just like emblazoned across our foreheads.
Yeah, but it tells you everything you need to know. Everything you need to know for VO2 max. Yeah. It's end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume times heart rate times arterial minus venous oxygen difference. Okay?
Let's go.
Super complex. What are we getting at there? In the most simplistic way, the ability of the body to deliver oxygen to the muscle, and then the ability of the muscle to take that oxygen up and use it to produce energy during exercise. Okay, so we started with a really complex version of that equation, really simplistic. Is there some kind of meat in the middle? So let's look at that Fick equation and the complex things that are in it and understand why they're relevant. All right, so end diastolic volume is a measure of how much blood is making it into the heart, particularly the left ventricle of the heart when it's relaxing. So our heart relaxes and then it pumps all that blood out. And so end diastolic volume is how much blood is making it into the heart when it's relaxing. Then we have end systolic volume, and that's how much blood is left in the heart after the heart has pumped blood out. When the heart pumps, it doesn't pump all the blood out. There's a a substantial portion of it remaining. And so the difference between those two and diastolic volume and systolic volume really reflects what we refer to as stroke volume. This is huge. This is absolutely key. We need to understand stroke volume. And what that is every time the heart beats, how much blood is it pumping out? And that's key. That's going to be the key driver of VO2 max and adaptation to VO2 max.
And a beautiful indicator of your overall cardiovascular health.
Certainly. And that's the one that can be moved the most. Then heart rate. We all know what heart rate is. It's super easy, super accessible. But it, again, like you said, is a fantastic indicator of cardiovascular health, fitness, health span. And it's super easy to measure. And that doesn't devalue it, right? How many times the heart is beating per minute. And if we look at our stroke volume, how much blood the heart is getting out every time it beats, and then our heart rate, which is how many times the heart's beating per minute, we can calculate what's known as our cardiac output. And that's simply put, how much blood is our heart pumping out per minute. We said VO2 max is determined by how much oxygen is getting to the muscle, and then how much is being taken up by the muscle. Cardiac output tells us that first half of that equation, how much oxygen is getting to the muscle. The second half, arterial minus venous oxygen difference. Our arterial blood is the blood that takes the oxygen and the blood that's leaving the heart, right? So this is really a reflection of how much oxygen is there in the blood that's making its way to the muscle. And then the venous oxygen content really reflects, or really what it is how much oxygen is in the blood leaving the muscle. So the difference between those two represents how much blood is being taken up. As an example, right? If I have a plate of food with 10 Skittles on it, let's say, for instance, right? And I give them to my daughter and she eats 8, then we know there's 2 left. And so 10 minus 2 is 8. That's how much the daughter or the muscle took up. So arterial minus venous oxygen difference. And so when we think about moving VO2 max, which is what's so important here, right? It comes down to, are we more worried about the central factors, heart rate and stroke volume, or are we more worried about the peripheral factors, or the ability of the muscle to take up and use oxygen, which are essential? It's been a long-standing debate. What is the limiter behind VO2 max? Is it more central or is it more peripheral? VO2 max was discovered over 100 years ago, and what's funny is exercise physiologists are still debating that today, but the answer is quite clear. And there's a really interesting conversation. A physiologist named Tim Noakes, for years he's been pitching this central governor theory, right, that basically says that myocardial ischemia, or the lack of blood flow going to the heart, tells our brain that we're in trouble when we're exercising, and so that's the limiter. But there's just so much data to refute that theory. And we now know almost for certain, and this was also acknowledged back when VO2 max, the concept was coined by A.V. Hill back in the 1920s, that VO2 max is indeed limited centrally. There's a beautiful experiment by world-renowned physiologist Ben Saltine in 1985 where he measured oxygen consumption by the skeletal muscle under 2 different circumstances. And he took subjects and he put them in this single leg kicking device, and he had them just kick as hard and as fast as they can with one leg. And he measured how much oxygen the muscle could use. He brought them back in a few days later and had them do a full body VO2 max test on a cycloergometer, and also measured how much oxygen the muscle could use. And what he showed really solved this debate, and that's that during the single leg kicking exercise, the muscle was taking up 2 to 3 times the amount of oxygen that it was able to take up when we were doing whole body exercise, which just irrefutably proves that the muscle can take far more oxygen than's being delivered to it during full body maximal exercise. We know for absolute certain that it's centrally limited.
When we look at the factors, the physiological factors that determine VO2 max, what is that laundry list? And then if we can just go into, there's some athletes that we can think about, like a Michael Jordan, a Michael Phelps, a Sue Bird, that just have this like engine that you're just like, they can go forever, it seems. Now, did they just come out of the womb? Or is it trained? would love to kind of understand from a genetic perspective what the research says, and then that laundry list of kind of physiological factors.
There's a beautiful study known as the Heritage Family Study, and it was conducted by a physiologist, Claude Bouchard. And what they did in that study is they recruited 500 adults from 100 families. The purpose of the study was broad. In addition to VO2 max and cardiovascular health, they were looking at musculoskeletal health, hormonal responses, all to aerobic training. And what they showed was simple, but also very insightful. And they showed that there's 2.5 times more variance in fitness, or VO2 max, between than within families. And they concluded that the maximal heritability of VO2 max is around 47%. Which I think is pretty cool from the perspective of our listeners and us as exercise physiologists.
No excuses.
Right. Because it means
we can move this sucker.
It's more than half of it can be moved by our lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so how do we move that? Well, we engage in very structured and purposeful exercise, specifically targeting what we just talked about with the Fick equation, and we know is the central delivery of oxygen to the muscle. And so how do we move those factors? How do we move cardiac output? Well, we know cardiac output is determined by heart rate and stroke volume, and we can't train our heart rate, right? As a matter of fact, we know heart rate is coming down as we get older. So it's all about finding ways to increase stroke volume, or the amount of blood our heart is pumping out.
This is a good moment to just kind of remind folks that a lot of our ability to kind of tap into this modifiable portion of VO2 max is setting up conditions that allow you to go at your capacity. And I think that we can't really understate this enough, right? Like if I am showing up in my life chronically under recovered, overfueled, underfueled, underslept, I am going to be positioning myself, overtraining potentially. I'm going to position myself to not actually be able to maximize whatever my VO2 max potential might be. The foundation of, all right, how do I actually create the conditions that allow me to get to a place where I am optimizing my potential for VO2 max? And if there's anything you want to comment about that, but just this notion of building capacity through these other rocks are really important.
It takes everything for us to optimize these metrics, right? And when we're specifically training for something like VO2 max, it is a high intensity exercise that we're probably going to want to do. We can talk more about that, but that does require us to set the proper foundation, right?
Right. So, and I think it's worth noting, as we kind of get into the specifics of how to train VO2 max, if your foundation isn't great, anything you try to kind of layer on top of that is going to be more difficult. You're kind of handicapping yourself, right? So your ability to move VO2 max and the pace at which you move that is kind of contingent on this foundation, right? If this foundation is really has lots of cracks in it, then you can't have a lot of expectation in terms of your ability to move this number.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a lot of research out there that has noted substantial inter-individual variability in training responses, right? And so there are even plenty of studies, that we do on the performance science team where we see people who are responders and non-responders. Right. And this notion of a non-responder, and this is kind of, my biased view, I don't think it exists. I think most likely there are people who probably don't respond, but I think those people are probably not getting the right stimulus. And that doesn't necessarily have to be what training they're doing to go in, right? It could be how much they're sleeping or sundry of other variables.
Right.
Exactly.
And this is, I think, also important to call out that this foundation is not just reserved for the top athletes in the world, right? I mean, this is for everyone, right? Like creating this foundation. If your goal is to increase your health span, which we know VO2 max is an excellent proxy that helps us understand your potential for longevity, this foundation needs to be tended to. Just remembering that, how we sleep, the consistency and the timing and the quality of our sleep, that is going to lay an enormous foundation for our ability to kind of train these systems in a way that really optimizes our potential. Let's look at VO2 max from the lens of performance, and let's look at it from the lens of longevity, which I don't think are orthogonal, but I think people in their minds think of them as such. And certainly there's really extreme versions of training that actually probably don't necessarily ladder up to longevity, right? I mean, there's a lot of really extreme things that have to go into being the top cyclist in the world, for example, that I think we could argue might not actually help with longevity in some way, right? Like potentially. So maybe just talk about the difference between performance and health.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things about VO2 Max I was thinking about in preparing for this episode is it is irrefutably the single best predictor of performance. If I'm trying to predict whether someone's going to win a gold medal, VO2 Max is going to predict it better than almost anything across sports. But it's also perhaps the single best predictor of whether or not someone needs a heart transplant or may not live a super long time. And how cool is it that we can have this one single metric that can predict outcomes across the health spectrum, from in the greatest of athletes to some of the most unhealthy individuals. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. It's pretty cool.
It's very cool. And maybe just talk about the values. So let's do women first, and then we'll do men and age brackets. A decade is probably enough, but if we can just kind of move through 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and then what those values should look like. Anything else you need to add that creates enough context for folks who have never heard about these numbers before?
Just to kind of provide a bit more substance to my previous comment about it being such a robust predictor of longevity across the health span, and this kind of sets the table, I think, for providing some of those values. This has been known for some time. World-renowned exercise physiologist Steve Blair back in the 1980s published a paper when he was at the Institute for Aerobic Research in Dallas, 15,000 people, showing and concluding it was a longitudinal study about 10 years that higher levels of fitness, and they concluded this in the conclusion of the abstract of the paper, delay mortality, point blank, due to lower rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer. And so what exactly does this look like? In 2002, Jonathan Myers at Stanford published a groundbreaking paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. 6,000 men, 1,000 of them died. They concluded that, and this is pretty neat in my opinion, a 1 MET increase in your VO2 max, and so a metabolic equivalent is equal to 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute as far as relative VO2 max goes, is associated with a 12% increase in survival. Furthermore, they broke their participants...
3 MET.
3 METs, 3.5. And we're talking training adaptations, right? 3 or 4 months of training, we're seeing increases on average of 20 to 30%. And so if you have someone who has a VO2 max of 35, which would probably be the average for maybe a 40-year-old female, 35 milliliters per kilogram per minute. They do VO2 max focused aerobic training for 4 months. Their VO2 max increases by 20 or 30%. They've possibly reduced their risk of mortality by over a third. And what's really cool about it, and this has been repeatedly shown, Jonathan Myers published this paper in 2002, but then he most recently published a paper in 2022 that replicated these findings and what I'm about to say. And this most recent paper, just for context, nearly 1 million individuals, and it was a prospective study, so longitudinal study. All right, they broke their participants, these are almost 1 million people, down into quintiles, basically 20%, bottom 20%, next, et cetera, et cetera. The people in the highest fitness quintile were 4.5 times less likely to die than the individuals in the lowest fitness quintile, which is great if you have a high degree of fitness and not so good if you have this low degree of fitness. What does this look like? The high degree of fitness uniformly across almost all of these studies is right around 14 to 15 METs. So to put that in perspective, we're right around a VO2 of 45 to 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute. If you're over that, you are robustly protected from your
bulletproof.
Yeah, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, that's not saying that you should necessarily stop there. We want to see you. We know that there's a dose-response relation between increasing VO2 max and health span and mortality, right? But if you're in that quintile, you can be feeling very, very good about it. The really cool thing, though, is that the biggest benefit of increasing your fitness was not making it into the top, but it was going from those who were in the least fit group to slightly less fit. Just for an example, the people in the least fit group were 4.5 times more likely to die than those in the top. but the second least fit group was only 2 times more. So exercise is valuable. It's great to chase the highest level of fitness, but going from doing nothing to doing just a little bit, just going for a walk a few times a week, that's where you're going to get the greatest benefit. And I think that's a very powerful message for people who are intimidated about like 300 minutes per week of exercise. That stinks if you're not doing anything. And you may just say, well, the heck with it, I'm not going to get it. But you don't need to do that. All you need to do is go from doing nothing to doing just a little bit, and you are robustly going to increase your odds of living a longer, healthier life. And that's what's so cool about this.
I love it. That is such a compelling framing for our listeners. So thank you.
And it's been repeatedly shown in numerous studies. It's something is better than nothing all the time. The benefits of something are much greater than they are of doing a ton.
Right. So Greg, I think that's a really good framing for kind of the health side. Now let's talk a little bit about what does performance actually look like. So we know that, really quite a small dose of VO2 max type training over the course of a week, for months at a time, can move you from that bottom quartile to the next quartile, which is massive. And you just described the fact that can lead to, years on your life, right? Adding years onto your life, onto your health span. Let's talk about just the performance side of things. So for folks who are competing at really high levels, like what does VO2 max mean for them?
Both for performance and health, there really is no upper limit that we want to stop at. It's not like if we see 60, it's like, okay, this is like a good place to stop. It's like the higher we can get it, generally the better for both performance and health. When we look at the fittest individuals in the world, right? And they're always kind of like fun examples of things that are not realistic for 99.9% of us, but it does provide us, I think, a unique way of understanding.
Yeah, the extremes are important for us to understand. How do we kind of get into that middle ground where is kind of the sweet spot for most folks?
Yeah, and I think appreciating the function of it kind of allows us to back into the training of it. Yeah. So I want to start with just kind of a simple question that I would always ask my students, and I think a lot of people, they know, but they don't understand why. And that's, why is it that individuals who are more fit have a lower resting heart rate? And the answer is extremely simple, and it goes back to that Fick equation we were talking about. When we compare people who are the fittest in the world to even some of the least fit in the world, the truth is the amount of oxygen they need when they're sitting around at rest is relatively comparable. And it happens to be that can be delivered through about 5 liters of blood pumped around their body per minute, which super cool is about how many liters of blood we have. So it's just kind of neat to think when we're at rest, our body circulates our blood about once per minute. It's just kind of like a fascinating coincidence.
Yeah. When you zoom out, you're like, how is this even possible? It's just so tightly orchestrated. It's a miracle.
Our body's ability to circulate that 5 liters of blood once per minute looks very, very different in someone who is not trained versus trained. And so let's just think about someone who's, maybe moderately trained, average individual, healthy, has a resting heart rate of about 70 beats per minute. Let's just say you go to the doctor, 70 beats per minute, very average, okay? So if your heart's beating 70 times in a minute and it needs to circulate 5 liters of blood, we can do the math and we know that it's pumping out about 70 milliliters of blood per beat, which is about 3 ounces of blood per beat. Why is it then that someone who is more fit, their heart beats slowly? Well, we know cardiac output, or the amount of blood going around, still is 5 liters. And so if heart rate's coming down, that can only be due to one thing, and that's stroke volume going up. Let's say we have someone who's quite fit and they have a resting heart rate of 50 beats per minute. We know that is because their heart is pumping out far more blood. They're pumping out about 100 milliliters of blood per beat, which is pretty cool. Almost, 30% more than the unfit individual.
I think it's really interesting in our data that the fitter you are, the better you sleep, the more efficiently you sleep.
Yeah.
So it's like this incredible virtuous cycle. You know, people are like, I want to sleep better. First, fix your circadian rhythms, but that aside, get fit.
Get fit.
Because when you're creating conditions during sleep that actually allow for proper restoration and recovery, which allows you to go out the next day and have capacity to work.
And we see that not only with just sleep duration, right? We see that people who are fitter are getting more bang for their buck with their sleep. They're sleeping more efficiently. Their sleep
and are actually
consistency
spending
is
less
far
time
better.
in bed.
Right.
That's the thing to your duration point, which is like such an exciting revelation, really.
It's super cool. It's super cool.
It's so damn cool. Yeah.
So at the highest end of the spectrum, right, we're talking about like elite performance. Miguel Indurain, professional cyclist, was recorded as having a resting heart rate of 28 beats per minute at one point in time. So you do the reverse math on that. He had a stroke volume of about 160 milliliters per beat during rest. It is more than twice, right, what a normal individual has. So that's pretty cool to think about.
He's basically breathing 3 times in a minute?
Yeah, his heart's beating, 30 beats per minute. So it's beating like every 2 seconds his heart's beating.
So in terms of like his ability, he would only have to take 3 breaths per minute.
Yeah,
I think that's
it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. But then let's think about it during exercise, right? So that untrained person who their heart at rest or moderately trained, 70 beats per minute, 70 milliliters per beat. What's cool is during maximal exercise, let's say they can achieve a heart rate of 200 beats per minute, which is high, but maybe we're seeing it in like a 20-year-old. Their heart during maximal exercise can pump as much blood, their stroke volume, as someone who's really fit is pumping at rest. So that really fit person at rest, their heart is pumping as much blood as the less trained person can pump during maximal exercise. And so as a result of that, they're pumping out about 20 liters, 200 beats per minute times about 100 milliliters per beat, about 20 liters of blood per minute. On the very end of the fitness spectrum, fittest athletes ever, right? We have maybe they're still around 190 or 200 beats per minute, but their hearts are pumping out 200 to 220 milliliters of blood per beat. So they're achieving cardiac outputs of like 40 liters, which is like almost unthinkable. And another really cool way to think about that, right, is if our heart is beating 200 times or even 180 times per minute, it's beating 3 times every second, which to think about your heart beating 3 times every second is wild enough in and of itself. And when it does that, it's pumping out almost 8 ounces of blood. So our heart is essentially ejecting a 24-ounce water bottle every second.
Every second.
It's crazy to think about, right? And just like to be able to appreciate that from like a physiology perspective. And so as a result, they're able to consume 7 or 7.5 liters per minute of oxygen. The highest VO2 max ever recorded was actually recorded not that long ago and it was a very unique story. He started off as a skier and then 3 years of highly bike-specific training, his VO2 max went from mid to high 70s to 96.7 milliliters per kilogram per minute.
Wow.
So far, no human that we've ever been able to see has hit 100. It probably will happen here at some point in time. But 96.7 in a male, and then Paula Radcliffe as a female was recorded in the 70s. Unique about both these is they were both relatively young when this happened, so we're talking like 17 to 18 years of age. So the good news is we don't have to go chasing the highest VO2 max we're ever going to get because we know it starts to decline as we get older.
So VO2 max is going to decline. We talked about just giving our readers some referent values just so they can kind of ground themselves in. So we see the very top end athletes, men as high as 97 at the very top end, but probably really elite athletes. On average, men are probably in the 80s. Women are probably in the 70s. And generally speaking, those folks are going to be in their 20s-ish. And then when we get into kind of 30 to 40 year range, we can expect really elite athletes to be in that kind of 60 to probably 50, high-end 50 range for women. And then we kind of go down basically as we age.
Yeah, and there have been many beautiful studies that have looked at this. VO2 max begins to decline somewhere between 25 to 30 years of age, and it generally declines about 10% per decade.
But we can slow that down.
And we can slow that down.
And let's talk about how to do that.
Yeah, and there's beautiful studies done by John Halsey in particular, who's done a lot of this work, Andy Coggin, et cetera. And they've shown that in people who are able to sustain a high level of activity across the lifespan, that 10% per decade or declining 1% per year can be slowed down to maybe 1 to 2% per decade.
Yeah, I mean that's...
So how do we do that?
Yeah, how do we do that? So we hear a lot about metabolic flexibility. That's a very big buzzword, as it relates to VO2 max. I think people hear metabolic flexibility and VO2 max kind of in the same conversation. So maybe just break down what that means, why it matters, how it might be different for men and women, And how does that inform our training?
Metabolic flexibility, we're specifically referring to substrate utilization. We talked about how VO2 max is really our ability to produce energy or ATP using oxygen, but to produce that energy or ATP, right, we're needing to use fuel sources, be it fat versus carbohydrate. And so when we talk about metabolic flexibility, we're really referring to, from my understanding, our body's ability to transition between those fuel sources and to rely on whatever fuel source is optimal for the given intensity or exercise duration that we're trying to participate in.
The higher our VO2 max, the better we are at switching between these fuels.
Certainly, yeah. The training associated with both.
And a lot of that has to do with our mitochondrial health, right? If we kind of back up into the physiology, the fitter we are, the healthier our mitochondria. There you can see that relationship is really tight. You know, so when we talk about, increasing our fitness, we're increasing our metabolic flexibility and we're improving our mitochondrial health in the process.
That's part of a diverse training program.
Exactly, yeah. So when we think about VO2 max training, so our members are going to have this metric at their disposal now. You have just given them every reason in the world to improve VO2 max. How do they go about it? And if, again, we talked in the beginning of just backing into, okay, you know what, I'm a CrossFit athlete, that's all I do. How do we fit this into our day? And how do people create that framework? And then what actually do they do?
When we think about training, often I think we like to make it far more complex than it actually is. Steve Magnus just posted something on Twitter that I really loved, and it talked about the specific training routines of the most elite athletes. And it's they wake up.
It's so boring.
They have coffee. They take a poop, and then they go for a run. And then we have these really, fitness influencers, and it's they wake up from sleeping on their wooden beds, and they have some bulletproof coffee with butter in it, and then spin around 3 times.
Dunk their face in cold water.
With a snorkel, and put the wrong shoes on the wrong feet. It's not complex, right? And so if we're thinking about VO2 max, again, understanding the physiology, someone can hold a VO2 max effort depending on their level of fitness for 1 to 10 minutes. So how do we increase it? There's a principle in training known as the SAID principle, which is specific adaptations to imposed demands. If we are trying to improve our body's ability to sustain an effort lasts 1 to 10 minutes, we need to do maximal efforts that last 1 to 10 minutes in duration. That's what's been shown in the literature. Very common protocols for this. Papers, again, from Andy Coggan and John Hollizy, seminal training studies. 4 to 6 rounds, 5 minutes, essentially as hard as someone can go. They're doing 100 to 120% of their functional threshold power on a bike with 2.5 minutes of rest. But essentially, it's each of those 5-minute intervals needs to be as hard as you can sustain with 2.5 minutes of rest. Other things, 4 by 4 minutes with 4 minutes of rest is one that's tremendously popular. It's exactly accurate.
I do that every 10 days.
There you go. Right? There you go.
If people are just starting out on this journey, you're going to have to take time to figure out your sweet spot. Because when you first start going, you'll maybe go kind of hard for 30 seconds. You'll be like, oh my God, I started too fast. It's a level that you can sustain for 4 minutes, or even start 1 minute, at as hard a pace as you can go for that minute.
Yeah, this isn't the 30-second all-out where by the end you're walking.
No,
it's
exactly.
Ideally sustained effort.
It's sustained effort.
Yeah.
So, you're trying to get into that upper threshold of 85% to 95%, but just know it's going to take time to be able to get to a place where you're sustaining that threshold between 4 to 10 minutes, right? As you get fitter, the longer you're going to be able to sustain that upper threshold, but that takes time, to be really clear. So to start, folks will just want to go, a minute, I think, is a good place to start. You might be power walking for a minute. If you have been really sedentary, it might be a power walk for a minute.
Or you're on a steep treadmill.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Or, and I always go walking or running, but you can bike. There's lots of different modes. You can be in an erg, a ski bike, a cross-country ski. What are those called? The Nordic track.
Nordic track. Yeah.
So there's lots of different ways that you can get after it, but just know that it's going to take some time to kind of get to the place that you're describing.
Yeah, and we don't need to do this every day. In fact, please don't. Once, twice a week is plenty.
20% of your total training time
Or
should
less
be,
even, yeah.
or less should be spent in these zones.
People who are not accustomed to this, it's an extreme load. Like going all out is not necessarily a fun time, and it's not something that we should all be doing all the time. Again, building up into it, starting once a week with maybe 1 or 2 rounds of it if we're not accustomed to these types of things. Are really big. There's another just really cool paper that I want to talk about that was published in 2020 in the Scandinavian Journal of Sports Medicine by Brent Ronstad and Karsten Lundby from Norway. And they compared kind of this seminal 6x5 minute with 2.5 minutes of recovery that from John Halsey and Andy Coggan. And they compared it to these kind of Tabata style intervals that have kind of picked up in popularity. And in particular, they had folks do 3 9.5-minute rounds of 30 seconds. You want to go all out, go ahead. 30 seconds as hard as you can go with 15 seconds of rest. And you want the quickest 15 seconds of your life, try this workout because time never passes more quickly than when you're doing 15 seconds rest between 30-second all-out intervals. And this is one I use for all my athletes. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's 3 rounds of that. 3 rounds of 13 by 30 seconds all out with 15 seconds rest. And this is really cool. The cyclists they did this in, Kristen, had a VO2 max of 74 on average coming in. So these people were very, very fit. 3 weeks of this boosted their VO2 max 5%.
Yeah.
So you're starting with some of the fittest people on earth and boosting VO2 max 5%.
Yeah.
And it's novelty. So that's another thing that I think is really, really, really important when we're thinking about doing training. Consistency, in the words of one of my old soccer coach, right, is, maybe what pays the bills. But novelty also matters, right? And
a new stimulus is gonna accelerate adaptation.
Exactly. And so thinking about, it's not bad to think about fun ways to do these types of things, whether it be training modes or doing it. Yeah.
I mean, I do Tabata once a week, where it's 20 on, 15 off, or 30 on, 20 off, any of that type of ratio. I think to train that, you just think your first, get a really good warm up in, because if you don't, your first couple reps are going to be horrible. I see my data when I don't warm up, like I just can't get my heart rate up as high. So they're just not quality reps. So get your heart rate up in your warm up. So your first reps you're not sandbagging your first rep, because you really want to think about when you're doing the Tabata, it's like you want to think, all right, I can do 115 meters in 20 seconds, right? So not quite, but that
close.
That's aspirational. Yeah. Let's just say I can do that. That first rep, you want to get to kind of that 115 meters. And then your second rep, you want to get 115 meters. So as soon as you get to a place where in that 30-second period, you can no longer achieve that distance, you want to stop, right? And then maybe if you can just talk about quality of reps as it relates to VO2 max and why that's really important.
This is a mistake that I think people who are more new to exercise, I'm sure you as a coach see this all the time. And a lot of the athletes I'll work with, I think some of the biggest improvements they'll make is when they go easier during the easy portions of these rests. So, for instance, in the paper from Ronstad and Lundby, they're doing, again, 3 rounds of 13, 30 seconds all out, 15 seconds rest. But in between those rounds, there's like 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest.
Yeah.
And like when I'm telling people to pedal on a bike, it's like we're talking about like 20 watts. This has to be super, like easier than that of a walk. Like if you were putting out this energy on your feet, you'd be falling over. It'd be so easy.
Right.
Because if you are not taking sufficient, and this is huge, if you are not taking sufficient rest to where when you are doing those sets of work, you are able to maximally tax the system and you are working at a VO2 max level, then you're not going to improve VO2 max.
Exactly.
No one cares how easy you're going during the rest.
Right.
If you're doing 3 by mile for run, hallmark.
And this is
workout,
why HIIT is so ineffective.
Right. If you,
in terms of it's not training VO2 max, to be super clear.
Hard, if you're going moderately hard during the rest, you're not going hard at all. You might as well just go for a continuous run because it's physiologically the exact same.
Right.
There's no heroes made during the rest sets, right?
Well, that's amazing. So, and then I think if we think about our training over the course of a week, and any kind of programming, honestly, as long as you're moving is going to be better than nothing. There's no question about it. But there is a way to train, I think, efficiently, if we're looking at purely from a healthspan perspective, which we measure now, and in the most elegant way possible. VO2 max is one of those, kind of inputs.
And you'll see it's the most important input. If you're looking at what's changing your health span, it's like you maximize your VO2 max, you're all of a sudden 6 or 7 years younger. Yeah.
So when we talk about cardiorespiratory fitness and just cardiovascular fitness, like we're talking about 2 energy systems, of course, the aerobic and anaerobic. The VO2 max is taxing our anaerobic system, which is going to be these upper thresholds that we're talking about. And we do that 20% of the time, of course, a week. So twice per week at the very most for a relatively trained human. It could be one time a week for a person who's not as trained and you're building up to 2 times a week. But basically 2 times a week where you're really getting out of breath for a sustained period of time, resting completely in between repetitions, and you go as many rounds as you can sustain with quality. So that's going to be very different for you than it is for me. And then the other 80%, we're doing kind of base training, zone 2 type of training where it's a low effort. We do the talk test. We've done lots of podcasts. Paul Larson was one of our most popular podcasts where we talked about zone 2. So, refer to that if you need to understand zone 2. And then understanding we need to be lifting weights, right? And that's another input to our health span is the amount of time you're spending resistance training, right? So that's a really important part of your programming as well. Not to be overwhelmed, but if you were to kind of have to say, all right, for a person who's starting out, what is the taxonomy across these energy systems? Where should they start if they want to really move the needle in terms of health span?
Start going from doing nothing to doing something, and that's whatever will get you moving. People will often ask, not doing anything, like I'm trying to get into exercise. Should I do lifting or should I do walking? And you can say yes, but the truth is it's whichever you're going to consistently do. So going from doing nothing to doing something. Then, in an ideal world, you have all the time in the world. What are you doing? Lift weights twice a week if you can. If you're not lifting weights twice a week, then you're not maximizing your gains. So lift weights twice a week. And that matters whether or not you're trying to win the CrossFit games, but it also matters if you're trying to bend down or get in the car as you're getting older. It matters. It matters for running. It matters for cycling. There was a really neat study I saw published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning where they took, again, elite level cyclists who had very high 5-minute power outputs. Maybe they were around 350 watts, and they had them do strength training. And just that strength training alone significantly boosted their 5-minute power on the bike. So it is improving. And there's a lot of relations we see with this. With running, we know that lifting can speculatively maybe improve running economy, which is another huge factor that's going to ultimately relate to performance. So lift weights twice a week if you can. For aerobic exercise, it's been clearly outlined that we should try to achieve at least 150 minutes of activity. If all you're going to do is low intensity, well, then just do that. Now, if you can add in one high intensity session, do it. If you can add in 2, and one of the beauties of using Whoop, right, is when you're adding these in, you can look at your recoveries and look at your heart rate and your heart rate variability the next day. And it'll tell you if you're adding in too much too soon. If you're continually in the red, then doing another VO2 Max style workout that day is probably not the ticket.
And just as a reminder, being in the red is a signal that your body is not responding and adapting to the load that you're putting on it. It might be your training, but it could also just be other life load that is contributing, right? It's not just your training that recovery is picking up on. It's really all the inputs, right? It's how you're eating, how you're hydrating, and all of those things, work together to position you to be ready the next day. But if you're in the red, it means to take inventory across these big rocks that we know move recovery and just figure out where you might be going wrong.
And it's not a bad thing either, right? If I'm really trying to train for something, if I'm working with an athlete and I give them a high intensity workout and they're not in the red the next day, it's like, well, maybe they can do a little more,
or low
right?
Yellow. There should be a suppression, right?
Yeah.
In your heart rate variability. There should be increases in resting heart rate. That means that your body heard you put on a stimulus. And if you give it time to rest, it's going to adapt. And that adaptation will lead to growth if you give yourself the right amount of time to recover. Dr. Grosicki, this was super fun. Your knowledge just continues to impress me, and just really grateful for all the insight you're able to transfer today. I think it's going to be hugely beneficial. So
Thanks.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to get on, and particularly to talk about one of my favorite topics.
Yeah,
so,
I can tell that you're so passionate about it, and thank you again.
Thank you.